When Katharine Hepburn finally spoke about Humphrey Bogart, the world listened with quiet fascination. For decades, she had remained discreet, a woman of strength and silence in an industry that thrived on gossip. But when she finally chose to share her thoughts about the man behind that hard-edged, smoky voice and those piercing eyes, what she revealed was far from the image Hollywood had carefully crafted of its most stoic leading man. To Hepburn, Bogart wasn't just a screen legend. He was an enigma, deeply human, wildly complex, and profoundly misunderstood. To understand what made Hepburn's words about Bogart so meaningful, you have to know who she was. A woman who never settled for the easy answer, who lived on her own terms long before it was fashionable. Born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1907, Katharine Hepburn was raised in a home filled with debate, ideals, and defiance. Her father, Dr. Thomas Norval Hepburn, was a respected doctor and a passionate advocate for public health reform. Her mother, Catherine Martha Houghton Hepburn, was a feminist and a suffragist who campaigned for women's rights when that phrase still sparked outrage. From an early age, Hepburn was taught to think for herself. She wasn't raised to please, but to question, not to conform, but to lead. That fearless independence became her hallmark. She was athletic, sharp-tongued, and fiercely intelligent. She climbed trees, played sports with the boys, and didn't hesitate to speak her mind. That same defiant spark would later ignite one of the most extraordinary careers in Hollywood and define the woman who would one day work alongside Humphrey Bogart in one of cinema's most unforgettable collaborations. Her early years in acting were as unpredictable as her personality. After graduating from Bryn Mawr College, she pursued theater with relentless determination. Directors didn't quite know what to do with her. She wasn't soft-spoken or conventionally beautiful. She was direct, strong, and unapologetically different. Yet when she made her screen debut in A Bill of Divorcement, 1932, audiences couldn't look away. She radiated authenticity. Just a year later, she won her first Academy Award for Morning Glory, proving that Hollywood couldn't ignore her, even if it didn't always understand her. But by the late 1930s, the fickle Hollywood system had turned against her. After a string of commercial failures, the industry branded her box office poison. For most actors, that would have been the end. Not for Hepburn. She withdrew from Hollywood, reinvented herself on the stage, and returned stronger than ever with The Philadelphia Story, a play written specifically for her. When she brought it to film in 1940, her self-engineered comeback was nothing short of brilliant. It redefined her image and reminded everyone that talent and tenacity could outlast scandal and rejection. By the time Humphrey Bogart entered her orbit, Hepburn was already an established force, elegant, confident, and known for her sharp wit. Bogart, on the other hand, had spent years clawing his way up through the ranks of Hollywood's tough guy archetype. He was older, more reserved, and carried a quiet melancholy behind his steely exterior. Their worlds collided in 1951, when director John Huston cast them opposite each other in The African Queen. On paper, it seemed like an odd pairing: Hepburn, the polished New England intellectual, and Bogart, the hard-drinking, cynical icon of American masculinity. But on set, something extraordinary happened. Filming The African Queen was no easy task. It was shot in the Congo under brutal conditions, intense heat, swarming insects, and unpredictable weather. Many members of the crew fell ill, but Hepburn, ever disciplined and determined, refused to back down. She saw the film not just as another project, but as a test of endurance, a challenge she was born to meet. And beside her was Bogart, gruff and sardonic, masking his fatigue with humor and his own brand of stoic courage. They were opposites in nearly every way, yet somehow they found common ground. In her memoirs, Hepburn later described Bogart with surprising tenderness. "He was a complete professional," she wrote, "and beneath his roughness there was a kindness, a decency, that he rarely showed the world." On set, Bogart admired her dedication. She was always prepared, always precise, and unshaken by the chaos around them. While others wilted in the African heat, she stood tall, drinking gallons of water, refusing to complain. "Kate was made of iron," Bogart once said, "but the kind that shines, not rusts." Their respect for each other grew quietly. They shared an unspoken understanding, a mutual admiration between two actors who didn't need to pretend. Hepburn often remarked that Bogart reminded her of Spencer Tracy in certain ways: the quiet strength, the humor hidden behind cynicism, the instinctive honesty in his performances. She once said, "Humphrey was never one for artifice. He didn't act, and he was. And that's what made him so remarkable." When The African Queen was released, it became an instant classic, earning Bogart his only Academy Award and re-establishing Hepburn as one of the greatest actresses of her generation. Their on-screen chemistry was undeniable, a dance of contrasts, a balance of grace and grit that captured audiences worldwide. But what few people knew at the time was how deeply Hepburn had come to admire Bogart, not only as an actor, but as a man. Behind the scenes, she saw a different side of him. The world saw Bogart as the ultimate tough guy, the trench-coat-wearing detective, the man who could stare down danger without flinching. But Hepburn saw the thoughtful, introspective artist beneath the surface. She later confessed that Bogart had one of the keenest minds she'd ever encountered. He read constantly, she recalled. He loved books, he loved conversation, and he had this wonderfully dry sense of humor that could disarm you completely. Bogart, too, developed a quiet affection for Hepburn. He admired her intellect, her integrity, and the way she refused to compromise herself for anyone. Though they were both in long-term relationships, Bogart famously married to Lauren Bacall, Hepburn deeply committed to Spencer Tracy, their connection transcended romance. It was built on trust, respect, and an artist's shared understanding of the cost of truth in a world that often demanded illusion. Their friendship lasted until Bogart's death in 1957. When he passed away at the age of 57, Hepburn was deeply affected. She later described visiting him in his final days, recalling how fragile he had become, and yet how his spirit never dimmed. "Even then," she said, "he had that same twinkle, that same spark that made you believe he'd never truly leave us." In interviews years later, Hepburn would reflect on that time with quiet reverence. "I adored Bogey," she said simply. "He was a gentleman, not in the polished, polite way, but in the truest sense. He did his work, he cared for his friends, and he never pretended to be something he wasn't. That's rare. That's real." After Humphrey Bogart's passing, Katharine Hepburn found it difficult to talk about him publicly. For a woman who spent her life facing the press with unwavering candor, there was something about Bogart that made her guard her words carefully. She understood how sacred his privacy had been, how little he'd revealed about himself beyond the camera's reach. Yet over the years, as she grew older and more reflective, she began to share fragments of her truth. Glimpses of a friendship that had quietly shaped her understanding of artistry, integrity, and courage. When Hepburn looked back on The African Queen, she often spoke of it as more than a film. It was an experience that changed her. Working beside Bogart under such relentless conditions stripped away the glamour of Hollywood and reminded her what acting was truly about: honesty. There were no perfect costumes or controlled sets, no choreographed lighting to flatter. There was only the heat, the insects, the unpredictable river, and two actors trying to tell a story as truthfully as they could. "It was real life," she said once, "and that made it real art." She admired Bogart's resilience. While others sought approval, he pursued truth. He wasn't interested in being liked. He was interested in being authentic. Hepburn later said that Bogart's kind of masculinity was vanishing even then. Not the swaggering bravado that filled headlines, but a quieter confidence rooted in decency. "He never boasted," she said. "He didn't have to. When Bogey walked into a room, you simply knew you were in the presence of someone, unshakable. It wasn't that they were close in the conventional sense. They didn't share long lunches or trade personal secrets. But there was a mutual respect that didn't need words. On set, they developed a rhythm. Bogart would arrive, lines memorized, ready to work. Hepburn would bring her meticulous preparation, and together they would breathe life into each scene. John Huston, their director, once remarked that the two had the same kind of stubborn professionalism, a relentless pursuit of perfection that made every moment on film feel alive. Off camera, Hepburn saw glimpses of the man behind the legend. She recalled evenings when Bogart would sit quietly after shooting, a cigarette in hand, staring into the firelight with a kind of wistful humor. He would talk about sailing, about the ocean he loved, and about his belief that life, like water, was meant to move, never still, never stagnant. She remembered his laughter, too, dry, quick, and always self-deprecating. He laughed like he'd seen it all before, she said, and perhaps he had. Hepburn also witnessed the gentle way Bogart treated his wife, Lauren Bacall. Though their relationship was legendary, it was their quiet tenderness that struck her most. He adored Betty, she said, using Bacall's nickname. And she adored him. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady, loyal, and built on real friendship. To Hepburn, their love represented something rare in Hollywood, a bond not built on publicity or power, but on genuine connection. As time went on, Hepburn's admiration for Bogart deepened into something almost philosophical. She often compared him to Spencer Tracy, not because they were alike in temperament, but because both men shared a devotion to their craft that transcended ego. They worked the same way, she said. Quietly, purposefully. They didn't talk about the art of acting. They simply did it. In her mind, Bogart stood among the very few who had the courage to be ordinary on screen and, in doing so, became extraordinary. When asked years later what made the African Queen so enduring, Hepburn didn't hesitate. "It's because it's honest," she said. "There's no trickery. Bogey and I, we weren't pretending to be perfect. We were just two flawed people trying to survive something together. And that's what people see, truth." That idea, that authenticity could outshine glamour, became a defining theme of Hepburn's own philosophy, and she often credited Bogart for reminding her of it. She was candid about their differences, too. "Bogey was the drinker," she said with a smile. "I was the water drinker. He was a city soul. I loved the countryside. He liked jazz. I liked silence, but somehow it worked. We met in the middle, and that middle ground was respect." In that simplicity lay the foundation of their friendship, not built on shared lifestyles or gossip, but on a profound recognition of each other's truth. As the years turned into decades, Hollywood changed. The studios that once ruled the world began to crumble. The stars of the golden age faded, and new faces took their place. Yet Hepburn often lamented that with all the progress, something essential had been lost. That quiet dignity and sense of mystery embodied by actors like Bogart. "He didn't chase fame," she said. "He let the work speak. And that's why we're still talking about him." In her later interviews, Hepburn's voice softened whenever she mentioned his name. She spoke not of glamour or success, but of humanity. "Bogey had an anchor," she said. "He knew who he was, and that's why he never drifted. He had demons, of course, but he never let them consume him. He was real, in a world that rewards pretending." For Hepburn, that was the ultimate compliment. When she finally decided to write about him in her memoir, she did so sparingly, as if words might cheapen what she felt. Her reflections were less about nostalgia and more about gratitude. "He reminded me," she wrote, "that great acting isn't about performance. It's about being present. He taught me that courage on screen comes from honesty off screen." Friends who knew Hepburn well said that long after Bogart's death, she kept a framed photograph of the two of them on the set of The African Queen. In the picture, they're both laughing, soaked to the skin, exhausted but radiant. It wasn't a glamorous portrait, but it captured something deeper. Two artists at their purest, unguarded and alive. To those close to her, that photograph said more than any interview ever could. In her twilight years, when asked which co-star left the greatest mark on her, Hepburn paused. She'd worked with the finest, Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, Spencer Tracy, men who defined the silver screen. Yet after a long silence, she said softly, "Bogart, because he surprised me. He made me see that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet, steady, and deeply kind. It was perhaps the most revealing thing she ever said about him, and it captured the essence of what drew her to him from the beginning. Beneath the gruffness, beneath the hardened image that Hollywood built around him, she saw the real man, disciplined, thoughtful, generous, and profoundly human. As the years passed and retrospectives of the African Queen continued to air, Hepburn's memories of that time remained vivid. She often joked about the hardships, the endless mosquitoes, the unpredictable river, but behind the humor, there was always warmth. "It was the hardest film I ever made," she said, "but I wouldn't trade a single moment because of him." And so when Katharine Hepburn finally broke her silence about Humphrey Bogart, she didn't do it for headlines or legacy. She did it to honor truth, the truth of a friendship that transcended fame, of two professionals who respected each other enough to remain authentic in a world built on illusion. Her words were simple but resonant, carrying the quiet grace of a woman who had lived long enough to know what truly matters. "Bogey," she said in one of her last interviews, "wasn't perfect. None of us were. But he was real. And that, to me, is worth everything." In that single sentence, she captured the spirit of an era and the heart of a man who defined it. For all the glitz and grandeur of old Hollywood, Hepburn's final tribute to Humphrey Bogart was strikingly human, a reminder that behind the legends, behind the myths, there are souls who simply wanted to tell the truth, one frame at a time. And perhaps that is why their story endures, because it wasn't about romance or rivalry, but about respect. Two of the greatest actors of their time, bound not by spectacle, but by sincerity. As Hepburn once said, we were just people doing our best, and somehow that was enough.